requires a level of engagement that by understanding the conscious and the unconscious mind of your stakeholders, the people you're creating with, the people you're creating for, you have a much better chance of being able to create things that really do have value and can serve people. And at the core of this conversation is the importance to know that people do not always make decisions rationally. In fact, from an evolutionary perspective, we are actually wired to connect to our emotions and to be able to perceive and engage randomly versus follow the Newtonian physics of 1 + 1 = 2. In fact, if you follow the sort of 1 + 1 = 2 and you are predictable, then you will find yourself in a situation where you will see that there is the predictability, and not being creative, you expose yourself to vulnerability and risk. People will be able to predict where you're headed and be able to outcompete you. So at a very core level, creativity is important and fundamental to who we are as human beings, for the simple fact that it gives us a competitive advantage. While I was on the farm with my cousin, there were 4 of us on this farm in North Carolina. And on this farm, I remember I had a cousin named Derek, and Derek, would want to, after the snow would leave, would want to bring out his creations. And if I came out with a go-kart, I remember the look on his face, like, what was happening in your room that was different from what was happening in my room? And I think that's and reason why we're having this conversation is everyone is looking for, what's my edge? What is the conversation that I can bring to the table in this new world? The world is evolving. And the beautiful thing about creativity is that it's not stagnant. It gives you the capacity to move and ride the waves with the time. So as I take a step back, I'm a farm kid. I'm half farm kid from North Carolina, and I lived in New York the early part of my professional career. And then I came to South Africa just about 15 years ago. And if I looked at my farm life, from my New York City life to my life in North Carolina, my life in South Africa, and being able to sort of travel the world and engage the world around the ideas of, how the brain works, behavioral science, and helping people understand that creativity starts with you. Whether I was on the farm, whether I was in the city, or whether I was in the bottom part of the world in South Africa, the same principles apply. Doesn't matter if you're in Wuhan, China, if you're in Tokyo, if you're in Lagos, doesn't matter if you're in California, wherever you are in the world, we're all experiencing the sort of same complexity right now. And right now, as we go through this, I want you to interrogate yourself. I want you to sort of explore that the internal psychology of you has to be questioned. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to challenge you, and I'm going to push you to really think differently and fundamentally. Once I go through 2 phases, the internal and external, I'm going to do an exercise, and I'm going to give you space to be able to engage. And then once I finish with this exercise, we will then go through sort of a reflective space. And I'll narrate this space for you. But this is a safe space. This space is for us to be able to explore ourselves and the minds of other people. Welcome to Personal Behavioral Science as we kick off the I Am Creative MB It's a great privilege and a pleasure. Please check out my podcast, www.timothymaurice.com, or any podcast platform. It's called Brain and Brand. Please don't listen to it right now because you're supposed to be listening to me. And I'm going to encourage you that if you logged in now, and whether you're watching this on recording, follow this to the end. This is really important that you follow this to the end. I think that this is a process. It's not about just trying to take nuggets here or there, but try to follow it to the end. Let's go. Let's talk about the internal creative state. There are 3 areas I want to explore when it comes to what it takes in our own brains to be able to create at the highest level. What are we facing that creates the complexity, that creates the resistance to create? It all starts in the mind. The first is that in an environment where we are locked down, we are quarantined, where there's so much negativity and fake news, and Trump is a little bit confusing, we're not really sure and we look around the world, we're not sure. There's so many fundamentally confusing theories and conspiracy theories thrown around. What happens is toxicity starts to build up through stress. And this sort of entanglement of toxicity and allowing our information cells called neurons not to be able to fire and at the highest level, that reduces our capacity to be able to make connections. And this is extremely important because the creative process is all about making new connections. It's about, I had an experience once in the middle of traveling in the bush 4 years ago, and it's buried in your unconscious mind. And then all of a sudden, you see something on your way to work. That experience in the bush and what you experience on the way to work, what happens is the ability to make those connections is reduced if there's too much toxicity in the brain. And oftentimes what happens, we underestimate that the answers are already there, but our brain's sort of reduced ability to make these connections occurs because we're not aware of what's happening in our sort of creative state in the brain. So how do you reduce this toxicity to enable the brain to make more connections? Here's some simple tips. One is, if you put off your phone to 1 hour before you sleep, or you reduce your exposure, if you reduce your exposure to ultra blue lights, like on the phone or TV, then you go into what we call healing sleep up to 1 hour faster. And what that does for your brain is simple, is that it cleanses the toxins. Many of you may have experienced that you are having more lucid dreams over this period in quarantine, being locked down. It's one of the ways for the brain to cleanse toxicity. So if your dreams are much more alive than previously, just write it off as a quarantine lockdown experience. There are plenty of ways to reduce toxicity. You can stop following and engaging fake news and negative people. Ultimately, what you want to do in this space is reach out to people, follow people, and engage, manage your exposure to being online in a way where you reduce your levels of stress, where cortisol levels are reduced so you don't find yourself stressed about unnecessary stuff in this period. We've got enough stuff to deal with. You cannot fully escape stress at this space. What you really want to do and to reduce toxicity is go into a mindfulness state. And that mindfulness state simply requires that whether you're a meditator, you're a prayer, or it's about connecting with other people, or it's about going online less, you have to do what's best for you to reduce toxicity. The connectome is all the sort of connections in the brain. And the brain has millions, billions of ability to connect. And there's a term in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, which is simply the brain has the ability to rewire, to wire itself differently. And I mentioned the connectome as my second point of the internal state for a specific reason. That in a period like this, you want to be able to fire up the connectome. You have capacity to create all over the brain. You have the capacity to create at a very primitive level, at a cognitive prefrontal level, that the ability at the highest level, you have the ability to make connections in the connectome. And part of what's important about understanding your connectome is that when you began to sort of focus your attention and began to sort of think about creating, you began to think about the fact that I want to solve a problem. The first thing I want you to think about is that the moment you start stressing about solving a problem, there's a counterintuitive dynamic that happens. And that is that if you start to stress constantly about solving a problem, often what happens is you reduce the connectome's ability to be able to address a situation. So what do you do? What do you do in a situation where you have a problem facing you, like you need more money? your finances are in trouble, that your gigs have been canceled, you are in a situation where it seems nearly hopeless, or you have employees or you have people around you who need you, what do? The first thing that most people do is they whip out their computer, they whip out notepads, and they begin to vigorously try to solve the problem. Well, I want to suggest to you that your internal creative state works in a very fundamentally different way. The very simple thing I want you to think about in terms of firing up the connectome is consider quiet time, me time. Now, when you go and if you have kids or whatever, manage the expectation of your family members around you and say to them, look, I need to take a quiet bath. I need to fire up the candles, and I need about an hour to 2 hours by myself. What you do is that you slow down the prefrontal region of the brain. And when the thinking, the CEO, the execution part of the brain starts to slow down, what happens is you organically, inherently give the unconscious mind and some of the genius in the unconscious mind the capacity to start rising up. That's why when you stop thinking about things, often that's when the answer comes. So to fire up the connectome, you would think you want to rush to solve problems. The first thing I'm going to suggest you do is to go into either a quiet space or relaxation space or playful space. Sit down with your kids, put together a puzzle, relax in a space where you can draw a cartoon, a coloring book. It's the most counterintuitive logic. I get it. But all the science shows that sort of spin cycle that the prefrontal region goes into starts to slow down when you start taking care of you. So I know it's going to feel like a bit silly because we've been told, through the Enlightenment era, through Rene Descartes and the Enlightenment thinkers, I think, therefore I am. No, your emotions are also vitally important. So the connectome needs you to relax. There's a lot of stuff happening right now. The connectome needs you, your brain's connectome needs you to be able to sort of step back and take care of yourself in this period. So that's the second point. Number 3, your capacity, your brain's internal capacity, your nervous system's capacity. The thing about capacity to be able to create is this, is that as you begin to explore the idea that my internal psychology has the ability to shift, my internal psychology has the ability to make connections. If you start to own that, the question becomes, how do I increase my fundamental capacity? Believe it or not, once you remove stress, once you start to reach out to positive people, once you begin to sort of realize that my diet is a huge part of how my brain begins to sort of process and enabling my brain to be able to create, you realize that capacity is in ownership. It's in ownership of who you are as a creative, knowing that I'm going to reduce the negative sort of thinking and the framing in my mind by physically owning the idea that my brain is wired to create. One of the things that I do to add additional capacity is I reduce energy. So I create what we call the second brain. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the design phase. But the second brain is this. When you put your keys in the same place every day, when you make sure that all of your white shirts are in a specific place in the closet, when you make sure that your soap, your dishes, everything is in its space, what you're doing is creating a network around you so that you don't have to overthink. And what this does is gives your brain additional cognitive load, additional capacity. Now, capacity is important because what the brain is trying to do is preserve energy. Heuristics or shortcuts are part of allowing your brain to have more capacity. One of the most powerful and important heuristics is your name. When you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, your name is a shortcut. Even though you are evolving and you as a human being have moved on from the human being that you were 10 years ago, you still have the same name. Why? Because if you gave yourself a different name every single day, that would require a lot of energy to keep up with. Think about this for a moment. If every single day your partner changed their name and you woke up, you're like, hey, honey, how are you? It's like, no. Don't call me honey today. Call me this. I've changed. I've moved on from honey. I'm now baby. I'm no longer baby. I'm now whoever. You know, by the way, Teppo and Greg, they've changed their names a couple of times, but I've told them just for the purposes of lockdown, please keep the same name. It's a lot of stress trying to figure out what's going on with these guys. By the way, they're really well dressed. I know what you're thinking. Like, anyway, focus on me, guys. These guys are very handsome, but just focus on me. Anyway, so capacity can be increased by creating what we call a second brain and owning the fact that my second brain is vital to the creative process because I need capacity to create. If you're fundamentally stressed, you can't find your keys, you can't figure out where such and such, where they put, where you put your files, and it's chaos all around you, then what ends up happening? You reduce your capacity, your cognitive load. So toxicity, reduce toxicity. Fortunately, this is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to go back over it, fire up the connectome to be able to make connections and increase capacity. So your internal state can come alive in a very sort of creative way fairly easily by you taking ownership of these 3 steps. Now, into my second phase, the external creative state. Guys, this is about to blow your mind. What I love about behavioral science when it comes to decision making is that there's a concept that Roy Sutherland, the UK Ogilvy chairman, coined psychologic, which argues that we largely make decisions psychologically and emotionally, not logically, as economists like to argue. Here's a couple examples. I love Nike sneakers, but one of the reasons I'm frustrated with them is that they can try to sell me on things like the air boost of a particular shoe, the dynamics around the heel and how it's designed for performance. And then they tell me it's actually designed for walking or lifestyle, and I'm not supposed to run in it. But I'm like, how? But then why is it that you've got this bubble thing that you're selling me on the performance, but it's only a lifestyle shoe? Let me make this a bit more simple. When you go and you buy a Red Bull is an example that blows my mind. It tastes horrible, and it's in a really small can, but it's very expensive. The typical economic logic would argue that from a creative, innovative position, this is not a smart creation. But what it does is it solves for a psychologic. It solves for an emotional need. What does this need? The fact that it tastes horrible, we think it has medicinal properties. The fact that it's small means it must be really, really strong. So our stated, and the number one part of our external creative state and understanding the importance of creating with other people is that most people make decisions. The vast majority of our decisions are made on an emotive, unconscious level. It's like the placebo effect. If you feel that a doctor, because he has on a white coat or she has on a white coat, is smart, you start to feel the healing properties of what you're about to take. And through all sort of clinical trials, it's been important for the medical community to assert authority on the unconscious mind so that you can trigger healing. So the first point of this external creative state is that the stated versus the revealed, the stated versus the revealed preference. Let me give you another example. When people post sexy pictures and sexy videos on Instagram, they will say that the stated reason I'm doing this oftentimes is I want to inspire other people. That's why they'll put underneath, having a beautiful day, you can conquer anything. But then it's a bikini photo. So the stated version, the conscious reason why they think they're putting this out is that they feel as though they want to show you and they want to inspire you. But the reveal preference, if you follow over time and you follow the patterns, is this. The reveal reason is that they want to feel better about themselves. They want to feel affirmed. They want to feel that their body matters. So they start to stare at the like count. And if it gets more likes, they'll start to feel that this is something I should post often. So understanding your stakeholders, stated versus reveal preferences, is really important. And all of us get caught up between these two worlds. What we say we are interested in versus later on what's revealed. And when you study your stakeholder base and you look at who you're trying to create for, I want you to consider that this is the most normal thing. You may say that the reason I went to this particular restaurant is that I really wanted some really good food. But actually, maybe you wanted to be seen at that restaurant. Maybe you wanted to be in a space where the ambiance made you come alive to solve for some of the challenges you've been faced in quarantine. Now, this is going to happen at a very high level, which is my second point. The second point is be able to connect whatever idea, product, or service you have to people's emotional needs. When you look at who you're going to be creating for over the next sort of several weeks, maybe even the next year and a half until we find a vaccine, everyone is going to have these kind of unconscious emotional dilemmas. They're going to feel scared. Will the curve begin to go back? Will I go back into lockdown? So people may tell you that I need a product or I need an idea because of a very practical reason, but maybe they want to feel safe. And being able to create, whether you're an insurance brand or whether you're a car brand, to be able to make people feel safe is going to be very, very important in the next sort of creative chapter, in the next year and a half. The ability to trigger the kind of deeper unconscious emotional dynamics of the human experience is going to be very important. One of the ways you can do that is, in my third point, is to be able to create what I call a survival vision. And this is largely about managing expectations. So Dr. Tamar Gendler from Yale University has coined this concept called an ALEEF. An ALEEF is your imagination's beliefs. In your vision, you have the ability to articulate a clear vision and start to experience this vision in your unconscious mind. Many of us have already left lockdown in our emotions and in our mind, and we've already imagined ourselves on the beach. Some of you are separated from your partners, and you've already imagined what the hug is going to be like when you reconnect. I remember before I moved to South Africa, I heard all the stories, and I knew one person here, and I imagined myself moving from New York to South Africa. I imagined what it would be like. And largely my decision was made on what I call the vision, the ability to be able to live in an experience and what I would be like and the value I think I could offer and the people I would be able to meet and how it would enrich my life. So your ideas, your services should consider escorting people into their future. People are going to want to escape now. The creative process has to be undergirded by the simple idea that people want to feel that their vision and their future is safe. They're going to want to know that 2 years from now, how will me partnering with you and the products that you have, how will that offer me value? How will that create a dynamic? How will that create for me a better future for my kids? One of the strongest drivers in our human nature is to protect our bloodline. And I want you to hear me very clearly that every single human being right now unconsciously is thinking, how will this period impact my children and my children's children? And even if you do not have kids, how will this period impact the future? And so what happens is we often go into this sort of constrained bias laden space. And this is important for the creative process, that people, when they become scared and the environment is filled with complexity and uncertainty and consumer confidence goes down, we resort back to what we know. We resort back to what Daniel Kahneman calls our system one thinking, the predictable thinking. 5 plus 5 equals 10, 20 plus 20 equals me plus my job equals security. We resort back to the things that we think we know versus what he calls our system two thinking, which is where you have to put in work, where it requires energy. And so what's important is that you realize is that to get people thinking safe about their future, if you want them to consider a new idea, you've got to trigger their kind of emotional connection to your idea, not just the logical relationship, not just what the basic sort of tangible related ideas are, but fundamentally, in my future, if I connect to you, if I link to what you're offering, how will I be able to survive and thrive with this? And there's some brands that do this beautifully. When I think about, my own sort of work recently, I've partnered with a number of brands, and most of them right now are really sort of focused and locked in on just getting through this period. And to be a creative that really cares, and you start thinking about the moral challenges of what this moment calls for, yes, you do have to be concerned about now. And you do have to solve for the dilemmas that we're facing now. But ultimately, what real creatives do is inspire people to transport their customers, their stakeholders into the future, to be able to experience a tomorrow where they feel better about themselves. And if you begin to create a vision in your consumer's mind with what you're solving for, just remember that once they arrive there and they have been solved for this, you're going to create a much stronger bond and a much stronger connection. I look at right now, internationally, one of the biggest trending things is the Michael Jordan documentary series, The Last Dance. If I think about what and why the brand Jordan is so powerful, and why over 20 years after he's retired, people are still walking around with his shoes on, they will tell you that I buy these shoes. My stated preference of buying these shoes is I want to physically, have shoes to be able to walk in, maybe even to look cool in. But what is the reveal preference? They're trying to connect to Jordan's unblemished record of being 6-0 as a champion. The creative relationship between what people say and what they want, and what they revealed, and what they want in their emotions, and what they want in their vision, is often the responsibility of the creative. To know that people want to feel like their highest, most aspirational self is achievable. Plato argues that we all have in our mind this ideal version of who we are in our unconscious mind. All of us have it. And one of the challenges about a lockdown or any space where you're forced into isolation is that your ideal self is put on mute, that your ideal self is sort of chained down. It's that you feel like you're not able to create. And every stakeholder, including you, have the desire in our unconscious mind to produce, to connect with other people, to aspire, to feel as though anything is possible. And that's the beauty of the creative, is to be able to connect them with that anything is possible, that your unconscious ideal self is achievable. And I believe that when Plato argued this theory, and the reason why it still is so strong today, as the case with Michael Jordan, is that all of us have this sort of hero in our unconscious mind. All of us have this ability, this person in our unconscious mind that is our best self. And what creators do is help people bridge their current reality, which in this case, our current reality is the stone cold sort of reduced experience of being locked down, that kind of brutally cold state of being in a space where you're reduced to being locked down. But then your unconscious mind sees yourself traveling the world, connecting with extraordinary people, feeling good about what you can offer your children and their children and leaving a legacy. Somebody has to bridge these two spaces. Somebody has to be bold enough to say that your current reality versus your unconscious reality of being someone at a much higher level. Somebody has to do that. And I believe that's the responsibility of the creative and the innovator. If you have the courage to look into the future, if you have the courage to believe that tomorrow is going to be better. And one of the beauties of studying history, you realize these pandemics aren't new. As I said in the very beginning, from the 1400s to the 1600s to the 1918s, lockdowns in London. We know that chapters in history move on. One of my favorite creations and innovations during a severely limited space in history during the Great Depression was the chocolate chip cookie. The chocolate chip cookie was an innovation and a creation in the middle of one of the worst chapters in history. What is your chocolate chip cookie? In the middle of this creative space where Isaac Newton literally created the theory of gravity in the middle of a pandemic and a lockdown. I'm not saying that, as I mentioned in my earlier slide, I'm not saying that you need to stress yourself about creating these things. I'm saying they're already in you. I'm saying that deep down in you right now are some of the world's greatest innovations, some of the world's greatest creations that we need. But the ability to slow down, understand that our emotions are a bigger part of our decision-making than our logic, understanding that we all like to transport ourselves into the future, and we like to do so feeling good. This is why we buy brands that speak and signal to the world that we're important. Because our unconscious hero is an extraordinary person, and you should never deny the fact that your unconscious mind is a very important stakeholder in your own personal life. That's why I call this presentation personal behavioral science. Your unconscious stakeholder makes a lot of the decisions for you. And if you do not own the fact that this unlimited force inside of your unconscious mind, your ideal sort of creative self, has the ability to make connections if she or he slows down and recognizes that the genius in you is not just your ability to sit down and create, but your ability to understand that in our emotions lies this vast, extraordinary space to be able to feel and to relate to the world. I want to now, in the next sort of 15 minutes, I want us to go through a personal behavior design exercise. And the first part of the exercise, it goes back to my first point around the self, the internal space. I want you to design your second brain so that you can reduce capacity. And again, for those who just logged on, the second brain is if I leave my keys here, if I park in the same space, if I put all my dishes in a particular space, if I make sure that my key things around what I need for my child are in a particular corner, what you're doing is you're designing networks like a brain network, and that helps you reduce space. One of the things I do is you'll rarely see me wearing anything except for black and white. What that does is give me additional capacity. And I know when I go to my closet that I've got two options. I've got white shirts, I've got black shirts. Now, many of you are much more colorful and you're much more alive. Even my friends Steppo and Greg, they also like to dress a little bit eccentric sometimes. But for me, the majority of the time, I'm in black and white. And what that does is it enables me to develop my second brain in a way where I don't have to think about certain things. What I want to challenge you with is that in this first part of the exercise, I want you to literally design a system in your life to reduce capacity. So look around. What's taking a lot of your cognitive load? What's taking a lot of your energy? Is it the fact that you struggle with, you have your coffee put all over the place? Is it the fact that you haven't created sort of space in your day to go, I'm going to design what happens in my mornings? So let me take you through my sort of routine. So I live in an apartment building on the 15th floor. So I've got 7 floors of parking. What I do is I go through my run in the morning. Prior to that, I go through this sort of calm, mindfulness, meditative sort of space. Then I go for my run, and then I come back. I have my coffee. I'll have a juice, and then I'll begin to sort of connect with the day. I'll begin to sort of map. What I've done by doing that and having this sort of second brain operating is I'm not having to think, and then I release the capacity of my unconscious mind. And this is important. Your second brain's ability to contribute to your current sort of brain state is extraordinary. Now, by creating a diary, by creating a friendship sort of network, what you're doing is you're basically allowing your diary to take over some of the load of things that are sitting in your prefrontal regions. You're removing it so that you can fire up the connectome. So take a couple minutes, but I just want to go through the stakeholders and the external design process as well. I want you to sort of create a map at this moment and go, who are my clients and my stakeholders that I want to create for? Who are the stakeholders? What is the hierarchy? Where are some of the opportunities that I have at the moment to be able to create for this stakeholder database? Then I want you to look at what are my ideas, services, and products. And then I want you to ask, what is the emotional state? How can I trigger the emotional reality, the feelings of safety, the feelings of needing to feel beautiful, needing to feel important? How do I take my services, my ideas, my products, and solve for the emotional need, not just the practical need? And as you're going through this exercise, both from an internal psychological state of your, the internal state versus the external state, you'll see them start to come together. That your internal state, your ability to be able to have more connective power, to be in touch with your own emotional reality, to be able to quieten the noise and be able to connect internally, you have the ability to see your clients and your stakeholders in a much more honest light because you see yourself better. Now, if you're in a situation where your clients and your stakeholders are fundamentally different from you, then what you want to do is you want to say to you want to look at your team around you and sort of explore in a very honest way and not try to impose yourself and other people onto them, and not try to create this kind of simple archetypes to go, they think this because they live in this region, or just because they live in a particular type of home. Let's say your client is someone who lives in a traditional American, what we would call a ghetto. Just because they live there does not mean their unconscious mind's hero does not aspire to live outside of this space. So maybe you're trying to offer a product. I mean, if you look at some of the world's luxury brands, part of the reason that so many people who are in the middle class buy them, even though they can't afford them, is that they're trying to fit and outfit their unconscious mind. They want to feel better about themselves. I look back in my life and I remember one of the most expensive pair of shoes I bought was when I was 22 years old. I had no business buying these shoes. I think their brand was called Meslin. It was a hot brand back then. I kind of looked like a pastor if I think back on it. It was looked a little bit ridiculous, but they were hot back then. And you know, we all have those photos where we look a little bit ridiculous. Don't act like it's just me. We all have those photos. But at the time, having a pair of Meslin shoes, in my unconscious mind, I felt more fortified. I felt powerful, more together when I put those shoes on. It's very difficult to alter our psychology on our own, just thinking about it. Try to think about in this exercise we're going through now, where you're imagining your stakeholders. You're trying to imagine the mindset of your stakeholders and the emotional state of your stakeholders right now. It's difficult for your stakeholder and even yourself to cause your pupils to dilate. But the moment you put on a garment, the moment you experience something, the moment you walk into a space that lights you up, your internal psychology starts to move. So always remember this: the ability to connect with ideas, the ability to connect, has the extreme power to be able to alter the state and the vision and the power of the relationship between you and your stakeholder. So in this design exercise, firstly, what can you do to design things around you? Design me time moments to create space in your diary, to be able to create space around you that helps reduce capacity in your brain to allow you to be able to connect. Whether it's drinking neutral water, water that's pH level 7, 8, where you boost alpha waves, or whether an alpha waves, the reason and the fundamental purpose of alpha waves is to help the brain make more connections. Or whether it's eating better or running in place wherever you're locked down. Whatever you're doing in this sort of internal psychological state to reduce capacity, try to enjoy it. Try to celebrate the idea that I have answers in my unconscious mind. I have the ability to solve problems and connect in my unconscious mind in this sort of self-internal phase. And by designing an experience for myself that reduces capacity, I'm giving permission to my unconscious mind, to the genius in my unconscious mind, to be able to solve problems, to be able to create and innovate. And then as you start to get into the beautiful headspace of your stakeholders who you're trying to create for, just remember, have some compassion for them. People are hurting. There are many people who are scared out of their mind that everything they've ever thought they were going to be has been destroyed. So by having compassion for them and realizing that people do want to feel good, people want to feel important, people want to feel powerful, people want to feel enabled. If your product, services, and idea solve for that, you may find yourself having some of the greatest innovations in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, during the Great Depression, when this extraordinary woman who owned the coffee shop created the chocolate chip cookie, on paper, it didn't make a lot of sense. On paper, when she created this chocolate chip cookie, it didn't seem very innovative at the time, right? Take some dough, put these little chocolate chip. It didn't make a lot of sense. But what she discovered later, and what we've all discovered, is that sometimes we want to eat things that we know are not good for us, or we know that may not do what we're trying to accomplish consciously, but it solves for an unconscious dilemma of just needing to feel good. As we go through our reflective exercise, I want you to be thinking about how is this historical moment evolving and impacting you both internally and externally? I know for me right now, being in quarantine alone, that even though my entire family is in the States, I literally have no blood relatives here. Not a single blood relative in South Africa or on this continent. When I think about being locked down, I think the messaging and the neural triggering of being locked down, it creates this sort of barrier. I typically travel back to the States about 4 times a year. And I would have gone coming up, but it's been canceled. So the natural sort of order of the brain is to go into fear mode. It's to go into this space where it tries, the environment is sort of reducing my creative capacity, because if I don't control what's happening in my internal state, I will be fearful. I will be terrified. And I'm going to offer up a couple of questions. Anybody has any questions in a moment. for the last couple of minutes, but I really want you to be thinking about that. The real sort of language around lockdown and isolation and distancing goes against the creative sort of instincts. And that part of what I want you to be doing and fulfilling over this full day as you engage these great global sort of thinkers who are providing amazing content. And I want you to be thinking about that you have the ability to make decisions, to choose. Even though I won't see my family, I can emotionally connect with them. I can connect with them in my unconscious mind. As I mentioned, Dr. Tamara Gendler from Yale's philosophy around an alif. I can have an alif with my family. I can have an alif with my stakeholders. And that's the beauty and the sheer power of a creative process. I can escort myself from now into the minds and the hearts of the people I want to create for. And then I can provide a solution that will make them feel better. Try to say yes to that creative power. Try to say yes to the reality that we're facing, but also say yes to the creative power of connecting with people's emotions. That's what the creative job is, to help take people from reality, the cold, hard, stone, brutal reality, to the enormous poetic possibilities of the future. That's the role of the creative. And the ability to be able to have this conversation with you came from exactly that, from Puling and her team, from Estelle and her team, the ability to be able to connect people who believe in the sheer raw possibility of the future. That we have ideas, products, technology that can escort us from here to here. Puling, if there are any questions we have, I'd like to take those now. Thank you guys so much for whether you listen to the recording or whether you were listening live. I appreciate you and the ability to have a real conversation with you about what's happened in the human experience.